Chapter 3. Owen Alexander scowled at the newcomers he undoubtedly didn't regard as guests, even generations of good breeding failing to overcome his open hostility. Anna claims you don't charge a fee, he said the moment the door of the impressive library closed behind the equally impressive old-world butler who had escorted them here and announced them. Hollis was still trying to get over being announced in a private home and said almost absently, "No, I never charge fees." "Then why do it?" he demanded. She looked at him momentarily startled. The literal truth that she was an FBI agent trying to get a handle on her abilities and figure out how best to use them in investigations wasn't something she was free to share. Exactly, so she said, "I want to help people." By lying to them? DeMarco shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, perfectly aware that Hollis had a temper and didn't suffer fools gladly. Her blue eyes narrowed as she studied Alexander. "As far as I know, no spirit has ever lied to me, so I've never passed on a lie. They seem to be beyond that sort of petty human thing once they've died." Alexander blinked, clearly startled. "Most of your sort say past or something equally euphemistic," he said. "Kindly don't lump me into a group, Mr. Alexander. I also don't use tarot cards, crystal balls, tea leaves, read palms, go into trances, or insist anybody hold hands around a candlelit table. I don't ask for birth dates so I can use what most people know about their horoscope to get a few easy and pseudo hits without really trying. I just utilize the natural energy of my mind, which happens to be sensitive to a specific frequency, and use that tool to open a door so spirits can come through and talk to the living, assuming they want to. I often wonder why they bother, like now." She didn't say it, but it hung in the air between her narrowed gaze and Alexander's glare. DeMarco eyed the two of them, noting the disparity in size between Hollis's slender, almost frail-looking form and Alexander's tall, bulky, just the side of corpulent self, and silently bet on Hollis to win the standoff. In the end, there wasn't really a winner because the door opened and a middle-aged woman hurried in. She was lovely in a slightly faded way, dressed in something rather flowing and filmy that, to DeMarco's mind, would have been better suited to June than October, and possibly 30 or 40 years ago to boot. But what did he know about women's fashion? Less than nothing. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here to greet you," she said, a little breathless. "Oh, and honestly, haven't you even asked them to sit down?" Before he could respond, she ushered Hollis and DeMarco to a long, elegant silk sofa and sat down in a chair at right angles and nearest to Hollis. "Thomas should be back with coffee any time now." Thomas, DeMarco reflected, was clearly the butler. Owen hadn't spoken a word to the man. "I'm Anna Alexander, but of course you know that. Thank you so much for coming." Owen Alexander sat down on an identical sofa facing the visitors, his scowl gone but displeasure lingering around a grim mouth. "I thought you were resting," he said to his sister-in-law. "I didn't see any reason to disturb you. They're early." DeMarco said calmly, "The roads were better than we were led to believe. We got an early start just in case." "You're very welcome here," Anna Alexander assured him, her gaze flitting to Hollis almost hesitantly. "Forgive me, Miss Templeton." "Hollis, please, and he's Reese. We aren't very formal." She glanced around at the huge formal library, her mouth twisting slightly. "Then I hope you'll call me Anna, and my brother-in-law is Owen." She didn't look at him, but kept her gaze on Hollis. "Forgive me, Hollis, but I was told your methods of summoning spirit were somewhat unorthodox, so I wasn't certain how to prepare for the seance. I wasn't even certain which room would be best." Hollis and DeMarco exchanged quick glances, no telepathy necessary between them to share the realization that Anna Alexander had indeed spent a great deal of time with mediums and those who claimed to be. Enough, at least, to pick up the lingo. Clearing her throat, Hollis said, "Well, first you need to understand they don't really summon anything. In my experience, mediums are simply people who have the ability to open a kind of door for a certain type of energy to enter our space or dimension." "Spiritual energy?" Anna's hands, clasped together in her lap, were twisting restlessly, even though her voice was calm, relatively. Hollis nodded. There's nothing inhuman about it, nothing magical. In fact, it's based on science being seriously researched in many different reputable facilities around the world as we speak. It's an ability, the way some people have an ear for music or an uncanny flair for mathematics or physics. The theory is some people are hardwired to pick up and interpret electromagnetic energy on certain frequencies. Each medium's frequency is different, which is why we get as many misses as hits and why we tend to use our abilities differently. Some mediums see the dead, some hear them, and a relative few of us can do both. But it's perfectly natural to us. It's how the human brain works, after all, using electromagnetic energy. What I've learned to use to an extent is just another sense. A short laugh escaped Owen. Well, you're original, I'll give you that much. So it's just a sense and not a gift, huh? Before Anna could offer a fluttering apology, as she showed every sign of doing, Hollis looked at Owen and answered him in a very deliberate tone. Believe me, most of the genuine mediums I know would never call it a gift, what we can do. At best, it's something we learn to live with, and hopefully learn to control and make some decent use of. At worst, it takes over our lives and sometimes makes us question our sanity. And do you question yours? He asks. He should have said asked or was asking, but it says he asking mockingly. Only on days like this. DeMarco spoke without haste, but still managed to soothe their agitated hostess and silence her brother-in-law, to say nothing of calming Hollis, at least slightly. I think the best thing to do right now would be for us to begin the reading. Owen muttered, don't you mean seance? Hollis prefers the term reading, since what she does involves none of the traditional trappings of a seance. She looked at him in slight surprise, but was prevented from asking him when he decided to toss the seance idea out the window, and the butler entered the room silently, carrying a large silver tray. Anna directed him to set it on the coffee table and said, thank you, Thomas, I'll pour. Yes, madam, he retreated as silently as he'd arrived. Coffee first? Anna asked, tentatively. Knowing how cold she was likely to be after the reading, Hollis nodded with only a glance at DeMarco. Yes, thank you. They went through the curiously stilted ritual of being served coffee, both Hollis and DeMarco politely refusing little sandwiches and pastries on a tiered server. Owen and Alexander ate several of each. Hollis thought the polite visitor chit-chat their hostess doggedly maintained during the rather ceremonial coffee drinking was a bit ridiculous under the circumstances, and wasn't very happy that her partner courteously helped it along. Time was ticking away. It was dark now, and she was uneasily certain that they would be invited to spend the night. And Hollis didn't want to spend the night here, because her initial guess had been right. This house was definitely what any genuine medium would term haunted, very much so. She was already aware, on the periphery of her senses, that more than one restless spirit inhabited this old house, undoubtedly with things to communicate to the living. It wasn't that Hollis was afraid of them. She had long ago moved past fear in dealing with spirits, even if that had driven her in the beginning to block so fiercely that she had rarely seen, and even more rarely been able to hear spirits. Now she wasn't even sure she could block the quote-unquote door that most mediums spoke of, tended by this stage of her life to be almost always open as far as Hollis was concerned. Almost always. As with most abilities, it sometimes appeared to have a mind of its own, not subject to her will or needs. But even with time and experience under her belt, with all the advice and counsel of other mediums in the unit, she still hadn't reached a place within herself where she found the interaction with spirits at all normal or comfortable. She couldn't be matter-of-fact about it. And haunted houses promised sleepless nights. The dead didn't need to sleep and didn't seem to have any problem at all keeping the living up when it suited them. She set her coffee cup down on the table and said rather abruptly, "I know you've seen quite a few mediums since your husband died, Anna. Do you feel you were ever able to communicate with him?" Anna sent an uneasy glance toward Owen and said, "There were a few who seemed able to reach Daniel, but Google offers more information than they did," Owen said in disgust. Flickering candlelight thumps and bumps and spirit guides with low-pitched and heavily accented voices notwithstanding. Anna looked acutely unhappy. "I'm just not sure," she confessed to Hollis. "I thought at the time, but Owen is right. They didn't tell me anything they couldn't have found out easily beforehand." "What is it you expect him to tell you?" And when Owen snorted, Hollis added evenly, "I'm not asking for specifics, just wondering if you have a particular question in mind, or just need to know that he's at peace." A shaken laugh escaped Anna. "I feel a bit like Houdini's widow, but Daniel told me more than once that if there was anything beyond this life, he'd find a way to contact me and let me know. And he was an exceptionally strong and determined man, so if anyone could keep that promise, it would be him. He was not as cynical as Owen, but he was a realist and knew there was a good chance fraudulent mediums would try to take advantage of me. So we worked out a message only the two of us would know." "And so far no medium has delivered," DeMarco murmured. "So far no. Then a friend of mine who sits with me on the board of a major charity told me about Hollis." Hollis wanted to ask at least one of the questions tumbling through her mind, but DeMarco's fingers closed around her wrist and she remained silent. Outwardly, at least. How does Bishop manage to do stuff like that? Arrange stuff like that? Know when to arrange stuff like that? Because she had no doubt that he had, and it was one of the few true mysteries of life in the SCU. Not many secrets in a unit peopled with psychics, except the ones Bishop kept. Unaware, Anna said, "She said she'd heard wonderful things about your abilities, that you were genuine, and that you never took money for helping people communicate with loved ones. Even Owen had to admit he didn't know why you'd pretend to make contact if you couldn't. Unless you get off on delivering false hope to people," Owen said, his tone deliberately baiting. Hollis didn't bite, though she did look at him for a moment before returning her gaze to Anna. "Just please understand I don't channel spirits. I don't become them or anyone else other than myself. I don't have any spirit guides or, as I told Mr. Alexander, go into any kind of trance or become unconscious. I'm fully awake and aware the whole time. I just concentrate, really, try to focus." She hesitated, then added, "I can't promise anything will even happen. It doesn't always." "What a surprise," Owen Alexander drawled. Hollis looked at him, narrowed her eyes for a moment, then looked over his left shoulder. "You really should believe in spirits, Mr. Alexander," she said, more grim than triumphant. "Oh, and why is that?" "Because you've got one just behind you, and from the way she's looking at you, I'm guessing she's a former girlfriend or mistress. Did you kill her, or was it someone else?" Haven. "I knew I felt pain," Maggie said with a sigh. "A shot in the leg," Bishop confirmed, "not fatal or even especially serious under normal circumstances, but he lost a lot of blood and was in the middle of nowhere, with a wanted fugitive on his trail, highly motivated to catch him, especially if he posed a threat." John said, "You mean if he realized Luther is psychic?" "Yeah, if. And given Luther's tracking skills and his ability to hide in plain sight, I'm assuming that his target wouldn't have noticed his presence any other way." "Safe assumption," Maggie murmured, "though I'm not at all sure Jacoby's dogs wouldn't have heard or sensed somebody outside that cabin. Even somebody with the camouflage skills Luther has might not be a match for 3 well-trained guard dogs. By the way, how do you know he was shot in the leg?" "Callie." Maggie had to search her memory, but only briefly. "Callie Davis? She's your agent there?" "She is, and she's one of the few members on the team who can reach Miranda and me without the need for a cell tower or a landline, no matter how far away she is. Whether it's because she broadcasts on a frequency right in our range or because she's capable of focusing on a particular target when she sends is something we haven't determined yet. We do know that two-way communication exists only when Callie is the one who initiates it. Not even you and Miranda can reach her otherwise? So far, no. If her shields are up, they're impenetrable. But you got a message from her saying Luther had been shot in the leg. Not long ago, Bishop confirmed. Miranda is in California on a case and got the same message at the same time. Miranda was his wife and partner in every sense of the word, a team primary agent in the SCU, which often meant they worked different cases far away from each other, as they obviously were doing now, but their psychic connection was rather extraordinary. Distance between two people was one thing, being separated was something else entirely. Not being psychic himself and so lacking that particular mental and emotional link with his own beloved wife, John rather envied them their special closeness, even though he knew the same psychic connection that made them an amazingly strong team and solid anchor for the unit was also their Achilles heel. No one was completely sure, but they had some evidence to suggest that because their connection was extraordinarily deep and growing deeper as time passed, it had become a literal lifeline between them. Sever it and both could die, injure one and at the very least incapacitate the other, physically, emotionally, and psychically. How's Luther? Maggie asked. If she was aware of her husband's musings, she showed no outward sign of it. When Callie sent her message, he was sleeping. Out, really. She had sedated him. She dug the bullet out of his leg and took care of the wound. Don't worry, she's also one of my agents with EMS-level medical training. He's in good hands. And if Cole Jacoby tracks him to her place? There's a thing about her being able to repel negative energy, remember? And if that doesn't work, well, she's also good with a gun. Very good, in fact. John frowned and said if Jacoby was able to manipulate the minds of those agents during the transfer, as usual, Bishop was a step ahead, then why couldn't he affect Luther's mind, even if he couldn't get through to Callie's? Luther does have a shield of sorts. It should protect him, or at least make him aware if someone is attempting to get into his mind or control his actions. Virtually every psychic I've ever known has been able to detect attempts such as those. Maybe because they're so rare, Maggie mused, the unusual does tend to stand out. It does, Bishop agreed, which may be one reason why Jacoby's security escort never saw it coming. Remember, all Jacoby did with the agents was leave them with a few gaps in their memories. And neither one of them is psychic, so no protection, no shields, no awareness of a psychic intrusion. Even so, as far as we know, he wasn't able to do anything more than persuade them to take a wrong turn or two, pull the car over, uncuff him, and then take a nap, forgetting what they'd done. They woke up on the outskirts of a small town where it was easy for him to boost another car. It was Maggie's turn to frown. You said gaps, that they had gaps in their memories. When they woke up, they were about 100 miles west of where they should have been, Bishop admitted, and somewhere along the way, Jacoby must have been hungry because there were fast food wrappers in the back, courtesy of the driver's cash. Surveillance cameras? John asked. Yeah, the particular fast food restaurant he chose had been robbed so many times they ramped up security. There was a camera on the drive-thru, and we got to them before they could perform the usual end-of-the-week wipe of the footage. Was Jacoby visible? Maggie asked. No, a shadow in the back seat that must have been him, but he hid himself well, and before you asked, the agent driving as well as the one in the passenger seat seemed perfectly normal. Ordered food, paid for it, spoke to the employee at the window. All of the above, and nothing out of the ordinary. You mean nothing seemed to be, Maggie murmured. Exactly. The agents were, to all appearances, calm and casual, and neither showed any signs of being forced to act against their wills. John wondered aloud, does that creep anybody else out, or is it just me? Me too, Maggie said. Bishop, they don't remember any of that? No. Did he rob them? John asked. As a matter of fact, both their wallets had been cleaned out of cash, though no credit cards were taken, and both still had their credentials and cell phones. Weapons? Still holstered, not fired recently. So he didn't need a gun, John said slowly, or knew better than to steal one registered to a Fed. Apparently. Neither agent remembered either turning off course or stopping anywhere, but one agent woke up before the other one did to find their car parked just off the road and out of sight of any passing traffic, and to see his partner apparently sleeping peacefully. And Jacoby did that, Maggie said. All that. Jacoby did all that, Bishop agreed. Hollis, DeMarco warned, but she was beyond listening. The chill of goose flesh all over her body, the fine hair standing on end, the odd sensation of a cold breeze moving not around her but through her, all told her this was one of those times when the door between this world and whatever one chose to call the spiritual world was wide open. Barely hearing her partner, she watched instead the eerily, almost transparent spirit standing just behind Owen Alexander, concentrating hard so she could hear as well as see. Hearing them had been more difficult for her in the beginning, and still usually required intense focus from her. was his fault. What was his fault? Hollis asked the very pretty and rather startlingly young spirit. Owen glanced behind him as though against his will, scowled, and said sharply, "What are you—" "Quiet," Hollis ordered. "I can barely hear her as it is." "What was his fault? And who are you? What's your name?" "No, it wasn't his fault. Left me? He left me." "Left you where?" DeMarco, watching Owen, since he couldn't see what Hollis saw any more than anyone else in the room could, saw the older man's face whiten and a kind of dread creep into his eyes. Aside from Hollis's firm voice, the room was utterly silent. In the car, he told everyone it was stolen, but the car wasn't stolen. What happened? Missed a curve, went into the river. He got out. She shook her head, dark hair swirling eerily around her as though she stood even now in deep water. He got out and left me. Hollis was concentrating intensely. "What's your name?" "Jamie Bell." Her face changed suddenly, and she took a step sideways so she could see Owen's frozen face. It was such a long time ago. He didn't mean to do it, any of it. So it wasn't really his fault. He was showing off, going too fast the way boys do. And when the car went into the water, he was afraid. He panicked. I don't think he could have saved me anyway. The current was so strong. It was in the spring, and the river was swollen. He couldn't have saved me. Hollis wasn't so sure, but all she said was, "Do you need the car to be found? Your body laid to rest?" Jamie shook her head. "That doesn't matter so much. There isn't anything left of me, really, except this. I've been trying. I needed to tell him I forgive him." "That's what kept you here?" Jamie looked at Hollis pleadingly. "Tell him, please, that it wasn't his fault, that he can't let what's left of his life be ruined by that secret." "I'll tell him for your sake," Hollis said grudgingly. Jamie smiled for the first time. "Thank you. He really was the only thing keeping me here. My family and friends moved on a long, long time ago. They let go, but he never could forgive himself. Tell him he can, please." "I'll tell him." Hollis was about to ask if there was anything else she could do for Jamie, when she found herself suddenly almost flinching back as she blinked at the extraordinarily bright light that had appeared from nowhere. It seemed to have no distinct source, and yet it enveloped Jamie, leaving her in silhouette. The floating, quote-unquote, strands of hair that had been one indication to Hollis that she was looking at something otherworldly settled about her shoulders, and then she took a step forward, smiling at Hollis. For that moment, she looked flesh and blood real. "Thank you." "You're welcome," Hollis said slowly, watching as the light brightened even more, completely enveloping Jamie, and then dimmed, shrank, and vanished within seconds. "Well, what do you know?" Hollis blinked and looked at Reese. "There is the light after all. This time, at least." "You reacted physically," Reese told her, calm. Your pupils contracted. They did. Definitely. Hollis thought about that, then nodded. I'm not surprised. It was a very bright light and appeared suddenly. So you know something you didn't know yesterday, he responded. Worth the trip just for that. Anna asked eagerly, what did you see? Who was it? Hollis returned her attention to her supposed client. Not your husband, I'm afraid. I'm sorry. The spirit was here for your brother-in-law. Owen said harshly, I don't believe in that bullshit. Remaining calm, Hollis said, suit yourself, but my job is to pass on messages, and I just got one for you. Jamie Bell says you have to forgive yourself for what happened to her. I don't know what she drowned. You were driving, you lost control and missed a curve, and the car went into the river. The water was deep, the current fast. You managed to get out, but she didn't. If Owen had been pale before, he was sheet white now. Anna, clearly bewildered, said, I've never heard anything about a car accident. Owen, it was a long time ago, he said slowly, over 40 years, long before you met Daniel. I wasn't much more than a kid myself and scared half out of my mind. When I made it back here, Dad and Daniel went back to the river with me. We tried, but we couldn't even find the car. The current had already taken it. There was no rail in that curve, no visible signs of damage on or near the road. Neutral, DeMarco said, I gather there was no police report. No. He at least had the grace to look guilty and avoid the steady gazes of the others. No, Dad, the family decided against it. I was only 18, headed for college in the fall. Jamie was a girl I met in Nashville. She didn't even tell her roommate she was leaving the city with anyone. Hollis wanted to be angry, to demand to know whether it had ever occurred to him that Jamie's family and friends had never known what had happened to her, had never been granted any sense of closure. But then he looked at her, finally, with haunted eyes, and Hollis felt her anger dim. Whatever mistakes this man had made, whatever sins he had committed, they clearly had affected his life. She forgave me? He asked, something in his voice. Ample evidence that he was still struggling to come up with a rational explanation as to how Hollis had known what she knew. Owen Alexander still didn't believe in spirits. She needed you to know that so she could move on. You're the only one left who even knew what happened to her. You're trying to tell me she's been here in this house all these years? Not in the way you mean, not haunting you or anything. She's been nearby, waiting for an opportunity to contact you. You weren't open to that sort of experience, so she had to wait for someone who was. As to where she waited, we're not sure if it's another dimension the way science would define it, or another plane of existence. Maybe it's even another kind of reality just out of sync with ours. We don't know. For a moment, Hollis reflected that whatever they were, the dimensions or alternate realities or whatever, had to be many and varied, since each medium's experience appeared to be unique. For instance, Diana Briscoe, a very powerful medium in their unit, was able to visit a gray place without even shadows, where nothing really existed in any sense, like a corridor between two worlds. A place Hollis had visited herself, which was creepy enough. The likelihood was that having been there and being a medium, she could well be drawn there without warning and against her will. That was something she hadn't really faced and didn't want to now. What, she's in limbo? Wherever she was, Hollis told him, she's moved on now. On to heaven? He was trying hard to sound mocking. Well, into a light place, however you choose to define it. I'm thinking better a light place than a dark one. You don't know? You mean, do I believe in heaven? Hollis recalled an experience that had occurred months in the past, and smiled without meaning to. Let's just say I've seen convincing evidence that heaven, or something a lot like it, must exist. And I'm supposed to just buy all this? I'm not selling anything, Mr. Alexander. I'm just telling you what I saw, what Jamie Bell told me. Now, you can decide it's all bullshit and go on with your life, or you can choose to accept the forgiveness offered to you and go on with your life, or you could ignore the whole thing and pretend today never even happened. Up to you. I'm just a messenger. She hesitated for a moment, then said unwillingly, Jamie told me that her family and friends had moved on a long time ago. So even though they never knew what happened to her, they must have known somehow that she was never coming home again, and made their peace with that. You were the one Jamie was worried about. You were the one she said needed to let go of what happened and moved on. And move on. His gaze avoided hers then, and he remained silent. Hollis turned her attention to Anna, who she realized with the start was looking at her with desperate hope. Reluctant to disappoint the older woman, she nevertheless said, I did tell you there was no way of knowing who might come through. Mr. Alexander was angry, and he made me angry, and sometimes strong emotions have a distinct focus. That was why Jamie came through. Well, that and the fact that she'd been waiting such a long time for someone who could open the door for her. And Daniel? Hollis rubbed one forearm absently, glancing down to see what she felt. No goosebumps or fine hair standing on end, and no sense of that strange wave of cold sweeping through her, the three things that almost always happened whenever she was in the presence of spirits. All had existed the whole time Jamie had been visible. She was still vaguely aware of spiritual energy around her, but it was distant, on the periphery of her senses, all of her senses, something new. I'm afraid the door's closed for the moment, she said, hoping it was because she was abruptly conscious of being very, very tired, physically and emotionally, and cold in a different way. She was only barely able to stop herself from shivering. DeMarco spoke up then to say, it might not show so much, Anna, but this takes a lot out of Hollis, a lot of her own energy. She needs to rest before she tries to contact your husband. I'll be happy to come back tomorrow, Hollis offered, not about to argue with her partner, since she wanted to take a very hot shower and then curl up and take a nap for about 12 hours. Anna was clearly disappointed, but spoke quickly to say there's absolutely no sense in you two making that long drive from town twice. You can stay the night here. In fact, you're welcome to stay as long as you feel it's necessary. It might even help, she added with more than a touch of pleading in her voice. If you spend more time in his house, it might be easier for you to contact Daniel. Oh, but please, the guest rooms are always ready, and there are two connected by a little sitting room on the second floor that I'm sure will suit you. Which, Hollis thought, neatly resolved their hostess's potentially awkward dilemma as to whether to ask if her unmarried guests needed one bedroom or two. Before she could gather her thoughts to form a refusal, she heard her partner smoothly accepting the invitation. Thank you, Anna. You saved me a long drive back to town with Hollis snoring in the passenger seat. I would not, Hollis said somewhat indignantly, snore or sleep. Besides, we didn't even bring luggage. Yes, we did. Since we hadn't unpacked at the hotel, I put both our bags in the car while you were discussing with the hotel manager the remarkable lack of high-speed internet. His sign said Wi-Fi was available, Hollis said irritably. Not just high-speed, but wireless. The sign didn't say a thing about it being available apparently only during a blue moon that happened to fall on a Thursday in December. Point made, DeMarco murmured. Truth in advertising. There ought to be consequences. Trust me, he knows that now. Anna said brightly, so that's settled. I'll have Thomas show you to your rooms and have your luggage brought up. You two can rest and freshen up, and we'll have dinner around 8:30. Is that all right? Hollis wanted to argue, but she was just too tired and cold. Maybe a hot shower would help, or maybe she'd take a little nap before dinner. At any rate, despite her misgivings, she admitted to herself that either was infinitely preferable to getting back into the car and heading back to that odd little town, especially since that odd little hotel in that odd little town didn't offer room service. And she had a strong hunch they rolled up the sidewalks in that town somewhere around sundown. Supper would be out of a vending machine if they didn't stay here and take advantage of the Alexanders' hospitality. Thank you, she said with a little laugh. That would be wonderful, Anna. Whether the spirits of the mansion would disturb her was only a faint and passing thought.